The rain fell in thick sluggish sheets carrying the stink of metal decay and old oil through the neon-lit streets. It seeped into the cracks of the crumbling pavement, mixing with the filth of a city that never stopped devouring itself. Felix Marlowe had spent enough years in the underbelly of Noveris Prime to know that some places never changed. The Spaceport District was one of them. It was the dumping ground of the desperate. A place where people came to disappear, to smuggle, to sell whatever they had. Whether that be cargo, stolen tech, or the last shreds of their dignity. The sector had no law except the kind that came with a knife to the ribs or a plasma bolt to the skull. Felix had been both the knife and the bolt before, but tonight he was just passing through, boots splashing through puddles slick with oil and old blood. He wasn't looking for trouble, he wasn't looking for anything at all. And then he saw her, a woman, no, a starving shadow. She stood under the awning of a boarded-up shop, her arms wrapped around herself as if she could hold her body together through sheer will. Her skin a rich shade of deep violet shimmered dully under the neon glow. She was drenched, long emerald green hair plastered against her cheeks, dripping down her shoulders in heavy strands. She had the kind of figure that would have turned heads in any other circumstance, tall, curvaceous, built with the natural elegance of her kind, but here her beauty was lost beneath the sharp angles of hunger. Her cheeks were hollow ribs faintly visible beneath the ragged scrap of fabric she wore as a dress. Felix had seen desperation before. He'd seen people beg, barter, steal, whatever it took to survive, but she wasn't doing any of that. She just stood there, swaying slightly, her head tilted down, watching the puddles form at her feet. When she spoke, her voice was barely louder than the rain. Like me, I just need food. Flat, empty, not pleading, not seductive, just a statement, as if she had already accepted whatever answer would come. No one even glanced in her direction. Felix stopped walking. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the way she didn't flinch when someone bumped past her. Maybe it was the way her fingers curled into her own arms, gripping her own skin like she could keep herself from vanishing. Or maybe it was because for the first time in a long while he saw someone who had already lost everything but was still standing. You're starving. His voice came out steadier than he felt. Her head lifted slightly, eyes flicking up. Felix had seen alien eyes before, but hers still caught him off guard, large and luminous, a striking shade of violet ringed gold, a predator's gaze on a body too weak to hunt. She didn't answer his statement, but the way her throat worked, the faint tremor in her fingers, told him everything. Felix sighed, raking a hand through his damp hair. He wasn't a savior, he wasn't someone who gave a damn about anyone else's problems, but he was heartless either. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a ration bar and tossed it toward her. For a second she didn't move, then with a speed that surprised him, she caught it, unwrapped it with shaking fingers, and bit into it like it might disappear if she hesitated. Felix watched her, chew the tension in her shoulders loosening, if only slightly. You got a name? He asked. She hesitated, swallowed. Sarah. It wasn't the first name she'd ever been given, but it was the only one she had left. Felix nodded, shifting his weight. You got somewhere to go, Sarah? The way her jaw tense told him everything. He exhaled through his nose. Damn it, every instinct told him to walk away. He had his own problems, ones that didn't involve taking in half-dead alien women from the gutter, but leaving her here like this felt like the kind of thing that would sit in his gut like a stone. Come with me. Her body went stiff. Felix wasn't an idiot. He knew exactly what kind of offers she had heard before. He could see the calculations in her gaze, measuring her options, gauging how bad this could go. He didn't try to convince her, didn't offer reassurances. He just turned and started walking. For a second he thought she wouldn't follow, then barely audible over the rain he heard soft footsteps behind him. She wasn't following because she trusted him, she was following because for the first time in a long time she had been given a choice, and right now that was enough. Felix led her through the labyrinth of rain-slick streets without a word. Sarah followed at a distance, 3 steps back. Not quite close enough to be walking with him, but not so far that she'd lose sight of his silhouette in the glow of flickering neon. She was used to moving like this in the shadows, just another piece of the city's refu, easy to overlook, but he had noticed her and she still wasn't sure if that made him a threat. Her body screamed at her to stop thinking, just walk, just survive, but years of instinct made her wary. Felix wasn't like the others. He hadn't asked what she really meant when she offered herself, hadn't smirked, grabbed her wrist, or named a price. Instead he had given her food and walked away as if she weren't worth anything more than that. That part stung. She was used to men looking at her like a commodity, but being ignored, that was unfamiliar. They reached a metal stairwell at the back of a rundown repair shop. The place stank of scorched wiring and engine grease, but it was solid, standing firm in a district where most buildings leaned like they were ready to collapse. Felix climbed the steps 2 at a time, then glanced over his shoulder when he reached the door. She hadn't moved. You're coming, or you planning on drowning out here? Sarah tightened her grip around her arms. Going inside meant giving up the one advantage she still had: distance. Well, are you helping me? Her voice came out steadier than she expected. Felix exhaled sharply, like the question annoyed him. Look, if you want some poetic speech about kindness and fate, find a preacher. I had extra food and you looked like you were a breath away from collapsing. He shrugged. That's it. She studied his face, searching for deceit, but his expression was unreadable, just sharp angles, tired eyes, and stubble that looked like he hadn't cared enough to shave in days. This wasn't charity, it wasn't cruelty either. He had given her food because he could not, because he expected something in return that more than anything made him dangerous. She swallowed and forced herself to climb the steps. Felix pushed open the door, then gestured her inside with an impatient tilt of his head. Sarah hesitated before stepping through. The air inside was warmer, tinged with the scent of metal and burnt circuitry. A cot was shoved against one wall next to a cluttered workbench covered in tools and half-disassembled tech. A storage unit hummed faintly in the corner, its surface dented but functional. This wasn't a home. It was a place to exist. Felix kicked the door shut and tossed his jacket over a chair. You can sit. Didn't move, he sighed, running a hand through his damp hair before yanking open the storage unit. He pulled out another ration bar and tossed it onto the small table near the cot. Ate, then sleep. You look like you need both. Still, she stood frozen. Felix turned to face her, eyes narrowing slightly. You waiting for an invitation no one gives? Something for nothing. Her voice was quieter now but firm. He stared at her for a long moment, then instead of answering, he pulled off his boots, sat on the cot, and leaned back against the wall, stretching out his legs. You want to starve? Be my guest, but I'm not forcing you to do anything. The casual way he said it, like her survival wasn't his problem, made her stomach twist. She wasn't sure if it was relief or something worse. Slowly she moved toward the table, picked up the ration bar and peeled back the wrapper. She ate slower this time, wary of making herself sick. Felix watched her out of the corner of his eye but didn't speak. Minutes passed in silence. When she finished, she licked the last crumbs from her fingers and glanced at him. He had one arm draped over his knee, watching her like he was still trying to figure out what to do with her. Sarah forced herself to hold his gaze. I can leave, Felix snorted. Yeah, where? She had no answer. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You don't have credits, papers, or anywhere to go. You step outside, you'll be starving again in 2 days if someone worse than me doesn't find you first. His voice wasn't cruel, just matter of fact. Sarah swallowed. So what happens now? Felix rubbed a hand over his jaw, sighing like this was a problem he hadn't meant to pick up. I don't know, I wasn't exactly planning on adopting a stray today. Something sharp twisted in her chest. She wasn't a stray, she was Sarah Lou Renee, daughter of the Zari people, a woman who had left behind everything for the chance at something better, and now she was here, standing in a stranger's room, eating food she hadn't earned. Felix must have seen the shift in her expression because he exhaled and ran a hand through his hair. Look, you can stay until you figure something out. I'm not promising anything long term, just don't make me regret this. Sarah studied him carefully. He hadn't asked for payment, he hadn't looked at her the way other men had. That unsettled her more than anything. Felix Marlowe wasn't a kind man, but he wasn't cruel either, and maybe for now that was enough. Sohar woke to warmth, not the sterile heat of malfunctioning vents or the suffocating press of too many bodies crammed into a shelter. This was different, steady, dry, and almost comforting. For a moment in that hazy space between sleep and waking, she forgot where she was. Then memory returned like a slow creeping tide. The rain, the streets, the man. Her eyes snapped open. She was still in Felix Marlowe's workshop, curled beneath a threadbare blanket on his stiff cot. The scent of oil and old metal clung to the air, grounding her. The dim emergency lights cast a dull orange glow over the cluttered room. Across from her, Felix sat slouched in a chair, arms crossed, head tilted slightly downward, but he wasn't asleep. His sharp grey eyes flicked toward her the second she moved. Sarah tensed, waiting for what she wasn't sure. Felix exhaled through His nose rubbing his temple. Figured you'd sleep longer. She pushed herself up, muscles protesting the movement. Didn't mean to sleep at all. His brow lifted slightly. Yeah, well, you needed it. Sarah ran a hand over her arms. She still felt hollow, but the edge of exhaustion had dulled sleep, had stolen some of her vigilance, but not enough to make her forget what she had learned in the streets. Nowhere was safe, and kindness always came with the cost. Felix, however, had yet to name his price. He had let her stay, had given her food, hadn't touched her, and that was what unnerved her most. Men who wanted nothing were far more dangerous than men who made their desires clear. She forced herself to meet his gaze. How long are you planning to let me stay? Felix leaned back, stretching out his legs, expression unreadable. Couple of days, maybe more, if you don't make my life difficult. A flicker of something bitter rose in her chest. I don't need you, do? He interrupted, voice firm. You're not in a position to argue. And I'm not asking for anything in return, just don't be stupid. Her jaw tightened. Sarah had fought to survive on her own for too long to let a stranger dictate the terms of her existence. Felix must have sensed her frustration, because he sighed, rubbing his face. Look, I'm not trying to insult you. I know what it's like to have nowhere to go. Something in his voice caught her off guard. It wasn't pity, it wasn't sympathy, it was something colder, something earned through experience. Sarah hesitated, watching him carefully, the way he carried himself, the practiced edge of his words. It told her more than he probably realized. He wasn't some self-righteous fool who took in strays out of guilt. He was a man who had been where she was, and for reasons she didn't yet understand, he had chosen to help her. Anyway, the realization unsettled her more than she cared to admit. She cleared her throat, shifting the subject. What do you do here? Felix gestured toward the scattered parts and half-disassembled machinery littering the workbench. Mechanic, mostly ship, sometimes weapons. She frowned. That pays enough to afford extra food. Felix snorted. Barely, but I know how to stretch credits when I need to. She studied him again, searching for deception. If he was lying, he was good at it. Silence stretched between them, not quite tense but heavy with unspoken questions. Then Sarah straightened. I can work. Felix raised an eyebrow. She crossed her arms, ignoring the stiffness in her joints. I'm not staying here for free. I don't need charity. If you fix ships, I can help. I know my way around engines, power cores, coolant systems. Felix's expression shifted. Dips, he echoed. You worked on them? Sarah hesitated. I learned enough. Felix studied her, as if weighing whether to believe her. Then finally he nodded. Fine, you want to work, you work, but if you break something, I'm throwing you out. SRA nearly smiled. Any? Felix pushed himself up from the chair, stretching his shoulders before gesturing toward the workbench. If you're serious, I've got a job to finish today. You can start now. Sarah stood, brushing off the lingering remnants of sleep. This wasn't a solution, it wasn't security, but it was something, and for now something was enough. The workshop pulsed with heat, not just from the machinery, though the air was thick with the scent of scorched metal, grease, and oil. The overhead lights cast a dull, yellowish glow, barely cutting through the haze of smoke from Felix's old plasma torch. The space was small, cluttered, filled with half-dismantled ship parts, discarded tools, and wires that snaked across the floor like veins. Sarah's skin was damp with sweat. It wasn't just the temperature. She sat at the workbench, sleeves pushed up past her elbows, fingers coated in the slick residue of coolant fluid as she stripped down the ship's faulty power core. The faint hum of residual energy vibrated beneath her touch, sending a gentle buzz through her fingertips. She exhaled slowly, steadying her hands across from her. Felix leaned against the table, arms crossed, watching, not just watching, observing. His eyes dragged over her movements, measuring, assessing, but there was something else beneath it, something heavier. It wasn't obvious, it wasn't blatant, but she could feel it curling through the air like a low charge before a storm. He was testing her. Sarah knew how to be watched. Men had always looked at her like a possession, a commodity to be bargained for. They had stripped her down with their eyes, calculated her worth in desperate glances and hungry smirks. Felix didn't do that. His gaze was weighty but unreadable, lingering not on her body but the precise way she moved, the way her fingers handled the delicate components. He studied her like he was trying to understand something about her that should have unsettled her. Instead, it sent heat curling through her spine. You're slow. Felix muttered, voice low, rough with disinterest that didn't match the way he was looking at her. SRA shot him a glare. I'm being careful, he smirked. Shifting slightly, legs spreading wider, careful, good, slow, gets you killed her. Fingers tightened around the tool in her hand, you planning to kill me for bad. Repairs. Felix chuckled, the sound low and smooth yet, but if you short that coil. And for the whole damn system I'll be pissed. Sarah rolled her eyes but returned her focus to the core. She should have been irritated by his commentary, but something else was gnawing at the edges of her thoughts. She could feel him, the heat of his presence, the steady weight of his gaze, the sharp unspoken tension between them coiling tight and low in her stomach. Her pulse ticked up. This was dangerous, not because she feared him, because she didn't. Felix exhaled sharply and pushed to his feet, stretching his arms over his head with a low groan. The shift in posture pulled his shirt taut across his chest, the fabric clinging to the cut of his torso before he rolled his shoulders, cracking out the tension. Sar swallowed. Her fingers flexed, suddenly aware of how raw her skin felt, how hyp sensitive every movement had become. Felix glanced at her. Take a break, I need a drink. Sarah hesitated, then wiped her hands on an old cloth and followed him across the workshop. The small kitchenette in the corner wasn't much, just a cooling unit, a rusted sink, and a handful of mismatched dishes shoved onto an overhead shelf. Felix grabbed a bottle from the counter, twisted off the cap, and took a slow sip before handing it to her. Sarah eyed him, where the scent of fermented spice and something smoky curled into the air between them. You don't trust me? Felix asked, voice edged with amusement. Zara met his gaze, then took the bottle and pressed it to her lips. The liquid burned, rich and sharp, sliding down her throat like liquid fire. It was stronger than she expected. Felix watched her the whole time, her grip on the bottle tightened. The tension between them had been slow burning, building in careful measured increments, but now it felt like a live wire sparking between them. She handed the bottle back, fingers brushing against his as he took it. The touch was brief, fleeting, deliberate. Felix smirked, his thumb ghosting over the rim of the bottle. You planning to thank me yet? Sarah tilted her head for what. Felix leaned in slightly, his a mix of smoke, metal, and something warm, something distinctly him. For not throwing you back onto the street. Sarah scoffed, that's a low bar for gratitude maybe, he murmured, but you're still here, and that was the real question, wasn't it? Why was she still here? Felix was trouble, not in the way of men who took what they wanted without asking, but in the way of men who made you want to give it to them anyway. That was dangerous, because she had survived this long by keeping her guard up, by keeping men at a distance, knowing they only ever wanted one thing. Felix hadn't asked for anything, and yet somehow he was the most dangerous man she had ever met. She stepped closer, tilting her chin up slightly. You expecting something? Felix. His smirk deepened, not yet the way he said it. It sent a pulse of heat through her blood. Felix wasn't asking, he was waiting, and Sarah, she wasn't sure whether she wanted to walk away or make him wait just a little bit longer. She exhaled, shaking her head. We should get back to work. Felix chuckled, dark amusement laced in the sound. Whatever you say, sweetheart. The word shouldn't have sent warmth curling through her chest, but it did, and as she turned back to the workbench, hand steady but pulse erratic, she knew this was only the beginning. The workshop was too small for this, too hot, too charged. The hum of cooling units droned in the background, but it did nothing to cut through the heat curling between them. It wasn't just from the engines, nor from the lingering warmth of Felix's cooking still thick in the air. It was them. Felix leaned back against the counter, arms crossed, gaze heavy. The dim light carved shadows over the sharp angles of his jaw, the slope of his throat, the bare forearms streak with grease. He had rolled his sleeves up past his elbows, exposing muscle lined with faint scars, evidence of old burns, past fights. A life that had been far from easy. Sarah stood across from him, gripping the rim of the counter behind her, forcing herself to stay still. The distance between them was nothing, a few feet, a few steps, yet it might as well have been a loaded weapon between them, one waiting to go off. Felix had been watching her all evening, not in the way men had leered at her before, not with expectation, not with crude hunger, but with awareness. It was worse, because Felix wasn't the kind of man who took, he was the kind who made you want to give, and that made him dangerous. You're quiet, he murmured, breaking the silence. First his voice was smooth but edged with something rougher, something unreadable. Sar arched a brow. You don't like it? Felix smirked, the corner of his mouth tilting in that lazy, self-assured way. Just not used to it. He pushed off the counter, slow, measured, every movement deliberate. He didn't rush, he didn't close the space between them all at once. He gave her a choice Sarah hated how much she noticed how much she felt him every inch closer, sent warmth curling low in her stomach, pooling between her thighs. Leaving her skin too tight, too aware she stayed still. Felix stopped just in front of her, close enough that she could smell him smoke metal spice from whatever he had been drinking. His eyes flickered over her, slow and deliberate, before settling on her mouth. She should have stepped away. She didn't. You going to run yet? He asked, voice lower now. Rougher. Sarah exhaled through her nose. I haven't decided. Felix's smirk deepened. But there was something sharper behind it. Liar. The word licked across her skin. Like a spark. Sarah's pulse kicked up. Felix lifted a hand slow enough that she could stop him. He wasn't testing her now, he was waiting. His fingers traced along her jaw, callous and warm, the roughness of them igniting a slow, deliberate fire under her skin. His thumb skimmed the edge of her mouth, barely a touch, but it sent a ripple of heat down her spine. She inhaled sharply, her fingers gripping the counter behind her like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. You want me to stop? He murmured. She should have said yes. She should have pushed him away. Instead her breath shuttered, betraying her. Felix's lips tilted, dark amusement flickering in his eyes. He leaned in just enough that she could feel the heat of his breath against her skin, feel the faint graze of his stubble along her cheek as his mouth hovered, not touching, not yet, just near enough to drive her insane. Sarah's nails dug into the counter. You're an ass. Felix hummed. You're still here. His hand drifted lower, fingers trailing down her throat, slow, his knuckles brushing against her collarbone. The contact was light, barely there, but it sent a sharp, aching pulse through her body, settling deep and low. His other hand came to rest beside her on the counter, caging her in without actually touching her. Sarah swallowed her pulse loud in her ears. Felix smirked, dipping his head just slightly, his mouth now inches from hers, still deciding. He murmured, it wasn't fair. It wasn't fair how he did this so effortlessly, how he unraveled her without even trying. Sarah's breath hitched, her body was already betraying her every nerve, a light burning with the heat of him. She tilted her chin up, challenging him, closing the space between them just a little more. Maybe be, she whispered. Felix let out a low, dark chuckle. That's cute, he murmured, voice like gravel and heat, and then he pulled back. The sudden absence of him was jarring, leaving her too hot, too cold, too aware of how much she had been leaning into him. Felix grinned, pleased with himself, like he had won something. Sarah's stomach twisted, her fingers itched to grab him, to pull him back in. Instead she exhaled sharply, schooling her expression into something unreadable. Felix leaned against the counter again, arms crossing over his chest, still watching her like he knew exactly what he had done to her. Sarah's jaw tightened too, could play this game. She stepped forward into his space, forcing him to uncross his arms. Felix blinked, not expecting that. Sarah tilted her head, her own smirk curving her lips. You're the one still standing here, she murmured, voice softer now, laced with something teasing, something dangerous. Felix's jaw tensed just slightly. She reached out, fingers tracing his wrist, his forearm, feeling the hard muscle beneath his skin. Felix's breath hitched, barely noticeable, but she noticed. Her smile deepened. She leaned up just enough that her mouth brushed against the corner of his jaw. Not quite a kiss, but not far from one either. Felix went still. Sarah exhaled against his skin, still deciding. She whispered, echoing his own words back at him. Felix cursed under his breath, voice horror, and grabbed her wrist, pulling her flush against him. Sarah's breath caught the heat of his body, was everywhere, solid, unyielding, devastatingly warm. Felix's grip was firm, but not rough, his thumb grazing over the inside of her wrist, over her pulse, fast, erratic, betraying her completely. His other hand skimmed down her waist, fingers brushing the curve of her hip, slow, calculated. You're playing with fire, he muttered. Sarah smiled, lips barely inches from his. The Mario. Felix's fingers tightened, then this time he didn't pull away. The air between them was thick, charged with something neither of them dared to name. Sarah stood rooted in place, her pulse unsteady, her breathing shallow. Felix was close, too close, his warmth pressing against her like a slow building fire. The dim glow of the workshop cast shadows over his face, highlighting the sharp lines of his jaw, the faint glint of mischief in his grey eyes. He was waiting, not pushing, not demanding, just waiting. Her fingers flexed at her sides, uncertain, before she let instinct take over. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted her hand, tracing the edge of his wrist where it rested against her waist. His skin was warm beneath her fingertips, rough with old Scars a contrast to the steady controlled way he held himself. Felix inhaled sharply, the sound barely audible. His thumb brushed over her hip, slow, deliberate, sending a small shiver up her spine. The tension between them was a silent conversation, one neither of them had spoken aloud, yet both understood perfectly. Then with a slow exhale, Sarah tilted her chin up, closing the last inch of space between them. Felix met her halfway. The kiss was unhurried, exploring a slow pull of warmth and undeniable gravity. He tasted of spice and something deeper, something uniquely him. His hand slid along her waist, fingers curling, gently holding but not restraining Sarah's side against his lips, her grip tightening slightly against his wrist. Felix exhaled through his nose, his other hand lifting to trace the curve of her back, his fingers pressing just enough to keep her near, to anchor both of them to the moment. The world outside faded. There was only this closeness, this warmth, this undeniable pull. Then a distant clang echoed from the workshop below. Felix froze, his breath still warm against her skin. Reality pressed back in, settling between them like an invisible force. For a long second neither of them moved. Then, with a slow exhale, Felix rested his forehead, head lightly against hers, his grip lingering, reluctant to pull away completely. Sarah swallowed, still catching her breath, her fingers brushing over his wrist before she finally stepped back. Felix studied her, his expression unreadable, but his gaze said everything. "This isn't over," he murmured, his voice low. Sarah didn't argue because they both knew the truth. Whatever this was, it had only just begun. The moment had passed, but the tension remained. Felix hadn't moved far. He stood at the workbench, running a cloth over his hands, pretending to focus on something mechanical, but Soha could feel it, his presence like a storm cloud just waiting to break open again. Her pulse still hadn't settled, the warmth of his touch, the way his breath had lingered against her skin, it clung to her, refusing to fade. And yet reality had returned just as quickly. Whatever this was, it wasn't simple. She exhaled, stepping toward him. So she said carefully, "What now?" Felix didn't look up immediately. He dragged the cloth between his fingers as if the movement gave him time to think. Finally he tossed it onto the table and met her gaze. "You tell me," he said, VO measured, unreadable. Sarah hesitated. The safe choice would be to walk away, to leave before this became something she couldn't control. But wasn't that what she had been doing her whole life? Running, surviving, never choosing. She straightened. "I'm not going anywhere." Fix's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, an almost imperceptible release of tension. "Good," he murmured. A loud bang from below shattered the fragile moment. Felix cursed under his breath, reaching for a tool belt as he strode toward the door. "Stay here," he muttered. Sarah frowned. What was that? Felix didn't answer. He was already heading down the stairs. She hesitated for half a second before following. Staying put wasn't in her nature. The repair shop below wasn't empty. A man stood near the entrance, silhouetted by the harsh glow of the street lamps. He was tall, built like someone who had seen too many fights but never lost one. His coat was heavy, lined with reinforced plating. A man prepared for trouble. Sarah's stomach twisted. She recognized the insignia stitched onto his shoulder. She froze. Felix, however, looked unimpressed. He crossed his arms and leaned against the counter. "You're early, Cade." The man, caged hair, tilted his head. "Thought you liked efficiency." Marlowe Sar stayed in the shadows, watching. Felix knew this man. That meant he was dangerous. Felix exhaled. "You here for a job or a fight?" Cade grinned. "Depends. You got what I need." Felix reached under the counter, pulling out a compact case, full charged, coated to your specs. He slid it across the counter. Cade didn't reach for it immediately. Instead his gaze drifted to her. Sarah's blood ran cold. "Didn't know you took in strays." Marlowe, Cade said smoothly. Felix didn't react. "She's none of your business." Cade smirked. "Everything in this district is my business." Sarah forced herself to stay still, to keep her expression blank, but inside she was screaming. She knew men like Cade, people who owned cities like this, who collected debts, who made problems disappear, and worse, she knew what they did to people like her. Cade turned back to Felix. "Let me guess, you don't even know what she is, do you?" Felix's jaw tightened. "I know enough." Cade chuckled. "I doubt that." He reached for the case, lifting it with ease. "Pleasure doing business, Marlowe, but a word of advice." Felix didn't answer, but his fingers twitched. "Ready?" Cade's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Some things aren't worth saving." Then he left the door shut with a heavy finality. Sarah let out a breath. She hadn't realized she was holding Felix Stayed where he was, fingers gripping the counter, staring at the space where Kate had stood sour. Swallowed. You know who I am, don't you? Felix finally looked at her. There was no judgment in his gaze, no hesitation, just certainty. Yeah, he said simply, I do. Sarah's throat tightened. And you're still letting me stay? Felix's lips twitched. Not quite a smile, not quite anything at all. Like I said, he murmured, I know. Enough. Something inside her cracked open, because for the first time in a very long time she wasn't just surviving, she was choosing, and maybe, just maybe, Felix was choosing her too.